This is not going to be like the videos that I usually do. Usually I take an air crash and then I analyze it, telling you what happened. Today we are going to be analyzing safety allegations made against an airline. But wait, let me get you up to speed. All of this started when a pilot at AirAsia India called the airline out for its alleged unsafe safety practices on his YouTube channel. Now, I have no idea who's in the right here. I don't work there. I don't know anyone that works there. All I'm going to do is go over the allegations made by the pilot to see if actions like those could cause an accident. So let's get to the allegations themselves. Number 1. Lack of downtime for pilots. Number 2. Insistence on flap 3 landings 98% of the time. And number 3. Lack of pandemic safeguards. I'm going to be looking at points 1 and 2 since point number 3 doesn't really have that much to do with aviation. Let's start off with the whole flap 3 debacle. But first, what are flaps? When a plane is coming into land, it needs to be flying quite slowly, relatively speaking, to land safely. It needs to be going slow enough so that the plane can safely touch down and stop on the runway. But flying slow isn't that easy. When your airspeed drops, your wings generate less lift, and the less lift you have a less stable airplane as you enter your short final. To fix this issue, we have flaps at the trailing edges of the wings. As the plane slows down, the flaps are extended, and with the extended flaps, the wing surface area increases and therefore it can generate a lot of lift at low speeds. This gives the plane that extra bit of lift as it comes into land. Now, allegedly, AirAsia asked its pilots to do 98% of their landings in the flap 3 configuration. In the flap 3 configuration, the flaps aren't extended as much as they can be. So in this configuration, you have less lift to work with. But that's okay if you can fly the approach at a higher speed. The final approach speed is obtained by adding the minimum speed of the airplane in its final landing configuration and the approach correction value. So if you have a bit more runway to work with, flap 3 landings are totally safe, and many airplanes do employ them to save fuel and reduce noise at airports. A flap 3 landing can save about 10 kilos or 20 pounds of fuel per flight on an A320. The issue, according to the whistleblower, is the insistence on 98% of landings being made in the flap 3 configuration. He feels like this will incentivize pilots to opt for a flap 3 approach when a full flap approach might have made more sense. Looking at all the airports that AirAsia India flies into, a lot of them are major international airports, but the pilot calls out Imphal Airport in India. Imphal is an airport in eastern India. The airport is flanked by high terrain and has a runway length of 2,700 meters or 9,000 feet. The A320 can get away with anywhere from 4,500 feet to about 6,400 feet of runway, but keep in mind you don't have that extra bit of runway that big airports give you. So the margin of error here is much lower. Now Imphal is at an elevation of about 2,500 feet. It is by no means one of the world's highest runways, but as airport elevation increases, you're going to need more runway to operate from there. Looking at the IFR approach for Imphal, you see that the ILS is set to 3.5 degrees. This is a little bit steeper than usual. Usually approaches are at about 3 degrees, and an increase of about zero point 0.5 may not seem like much, but it's going to add more speed to your approach that you will have to dissipate on the runway. But 3.5 degree approaches are in no way unheard of. For example, Heathrow, one of the world's busiest airports, is considering a 3.5 degree approach to reduce noise over the city. London City has a 5.5 degree approach for obstacle clearance reasons. The next page shows you the terrain around the area. As you can see, there's quite a bit of high terrain around the airport. There are terrain advisories left, right, and center, literally. So Imphal isn't the easiest airport to fly into. Those factors are not dangerous on their own, but they can make a bad situation worse. The next safety issue that was flagged by the pilot was the lack of downtime for the pilots. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like the airline was consistently pushing the pilots past their safe limits. At AirAsia India, pilots fly 6 days out of a week, so if a pilot starts his or her week on the 1st of July, they'll be flying from the 1st to the 6th of July, and the 7th of July is a day off for them. Now assume that someone falls sick on the 6th and cannot come into work that day. Allegedly, what AirAsia would do is that they'd move up that mandatory rest period from the 6th and then ask the pilots to come in on the 7th of July. The pilot alleges that this could lead to fatigue in pilots. He argues that when you're sick, you're not really resting, and asking pilots to come in too soon might fatigue them too much. So those are the two main safety allegations leveled against the airline. What I now want to do is to take a look at the history of aviation and see if these factors have played a major role in accidents in the past. So let's try to think of a scenario where these factors could lead to an accident. Imagine a scenario where a plane is coming into land and it's a little bit high on approach. That's not too far out, especially in an airport like Imphal with high terrain. If a plane is high on approach and if the pilot does not go around, the plane could touch down further down the runway, and this in certain situations can be disastrous. For example, in 2005, an Aero Republica DC-9 was landing at Cali Alfonso Bonilla Aragon Airport in Colombo. The plane touched down 892 meters or about 3,000 feet down the runway. The plane's landing gear collapsed and it ended up overrunning the runway. The same thing happened with Air India Express Flight 812 landing at Mangalore Airport. It also landed about 5,200 feet or 1,600 meters down the runway. In the case of ASL Airlines Hungary Flight 7332, a 737 that was landing at Bergamo Airport in Italy, the plane was a bit high on approach and it landed 2,000 meters or 6,500 feet from the foot of the runway. The plane also ended up overrunning the runway. Had they been making a 3.5-degree approach, this would have made the whole situation worse. Keep in mind, all of these airports had runways at about the 9,000-foot mark. In the case of Air India Express 812 and that of ASL Airlines Hungary Flight 7332, the pilots were fatigued and it affected their decision to land. Other pilots might have opted for a go-around, but these pilots opted to land. Their decision-making was indeed compromised. Now, there are tons of airports with runways that are much longer than 9,000 feet. A longer runway would allow them to safely stop even if they had landed a bit down the runway. So not every approach that is a bit high would lead to a runway overrun. But another thing we have to consider are environmental factors. Not all your landings are going to be under perfect conditions. Sometimes you might have a tailwind, sometimes the visibility will be a factor. But something that can really affect the stopping power of your plane is rain, and more specifically, a wet runway. A wet runway can reduce your plane's braking potential, especially if there is standing water on the runway. Look at American Airlines Flight 331. The plane landed further down the runway than expected, and since the runway had standing water on it, it impeded their braking. Adding fuel to the fire, they did not use full flaps, just like AirAsia is allegedly asking their pilots to do. In this case, a few factors that we discussed above came together to cause an accident. Look at Atlantic Airways Flight 670. The plane landed on a wet runway and it ended up hydroplaning and it overran the runway. So could these factors lead to an accident? Sure it can. Things can go wrong in a very specific way, like they have before, and it can cause an accident, especially at an airport like Imphal. I feel like we're watching an air crash investigation prequel right now. We've been told about safety lapses before an accident. The DGCA, or the Indian equivalent of the FAA, is looking into the alleged safety violations, and if they find that these rules violate safety norms, I'm sure they'll amend these practices. Sure, these small, alleged safety violations might not cause an accident right away, but if we do throw caution to the wind, one day, not tomorrow, not next week, but one day, all of these factors will come together and cause an accident. By then, it will be too late to act. What do you think? Do you think that AirAsia compromised on safety with these rules? And while you're down there, let me know what you thought of the audio on this episode. I got a new mic and I'm still calibrating it. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe, wash your hands.